the biting chill of a cavernous, dark pantry, a young woman, thin with haunted, expressive eyes and wearing threadbare clothes, freezes. Her clumsy movements, born of exhaustion and fear, have betrayed her. Dropped bread and cheese lie on the dusty stone floor, testament to her gnawing hunger. A tall, shadowy figure emerges silently from the deeper blackness of a doorway, his imposing frame radiating an unnerving calm. A flicker of something unreadable glints in his piercing blue eyes as he observes her, his face pale in the gloom, his dark, high-quality fabrics absorbing the scant light. Her heart pounds against her ribs. He doesn't shout. He doesn't call for help. Instead, a long-fingered hand gestures towards the darkness beyond the pantry. What fate awaits her in the depths of this silent, ancient mansion? Will this strange master offer salvation or a new kind of terror? Like the video and subscribe to the channel to catch more thrilling, emotional stories. Hit the bell and join our journey. The wind, a mournful beast, howled along the coastline of Oakhaven Bluffs, its breath carrying the sharp tang of salt and the melancholic scent of damp earth and decaying autumn leaves. It was a moonless, chilly night, the kind that gnawed at the bones and whispered of desolate endings. Grand, historic mansions punctuated the isolated stretch of land, their silhouettes stark against the bruised twilight sky, many bearing the scars of time and neglect like forgotten titans. Lena Petrova, 24 years old and feeling every one of her days like a leaden weight, shivered not just from the cold, but from the deep, aching hollowness in her stomach. Hunger was a relentless companion, its grip tightening with each passing hour. Her thin, threadbare jacket, once a vibrant blue, now faded and patched, offered little protection against the biting air. Her dark, tangled hair, a casualty of nights spent sleeping rough, whipped across her haunted, expressive eyes. Desperation, a cold, hard knot in her chest, was her sole motivator. She scanned the line of imposing structures, her gaze falling on one that seemed, if not welcoming, then at least less overtly fortified than its neighbors. Crow's Nest, the locals might have called it, had she known any, perched precariously on a cliff overlooking the turbulent, unseen Atlantic. Its lines were a confused, magnificent jumble of Victorian Gothic and older, sterner colonial styles, hinting at centuries of additions and secrets. Some of its windows were dark, like vacant eyes, while others showed the faintest ghostly glimmer from within, too weak to be reassuring. It looked less maintained in its immediate surroundings than some others, a patch of overgrown ivy here, a slightly listing fence there. The least secured, she prayed. The decision, born of pure animalistic need, solidified. Shame, a hot flush against her cold skin, warred with the primal urge to survive. She had to eat. It was as simple and as devastating as that. Skirting the main drive, her worn sneakers crunching softly on the gravel path overgrown with weeds, she made her way to the rear of the mansion, seeking a less obvious point of entry. The air here was thick with the smell of pine needles from the dense woods that encroached upon the property, and the constant, low roar of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the vast, indifferent silence of the night. A pantry window, small and grimy, set low in a stone wall, seemed her best chance. It was an old wooden-framed thing, its paint peeling. With trembling fingers, clumsy from exhaustion and the tremor of fear, Lena tested it. Locked, but the wood around the latch felt soft, possibly rotted. She fumbled in her pocket for the multi-tool her father had given her years ago, one of the few possessions she hadn't sold. The small screwdriver attachment was her hope. The grating sound of metal against old wood was terrifyingly loud in the stillness, each scrape echoing in her ears like a gunshot. She glanced around wildly, expecting lights to flare, alarms to blare, but only the wind answered, whistling through the eaves of the great house. Finally, with a sickening crack of splintering wood, the latch gave. She pushed the window inward, a wave of cold, stale air washing over her, carrying the scent of dust, old stone, and something else. Faint, unidentifiable spices, almost floral, but with an undercurrent of something ancient and dry. The opening was barely large enough. She squeezed through, scraping her hip, the rough stone cold against her skin. She landed with a soft thud on a stone floor, the impact jarring her already aching body. Inside, the darkness was profound, a smothering blanket. She waited a moment, her breath catching in her throat, listening. The house was not silent. There was the wind, of course, a constant mournful sigh through unseen cracks and chimneys. And beneath that, the ancient groans and creaks of a house settling, breathing. But then, a new sound, faint, almost imperceptible. A soft rustle? A footfall on a distant floorboard? She froze, every nerve ending alight. Was someone home? The sheer size of the place suggested it could swallow a dozen inhabitants without them ever meeting. The reclusive millionaire who supposedly owned it was, according to sparse online mentions she'd desperately scanned on a library computer days ago, a phantom himself. Her immediate goal reasserted itself: food. The gnawing ache in her stomach was a physical pain that eclipsed even her fear. Using the faint light filtering from the dirty window, she scanned her surroundings. Shelves lined the walls, some bare, others holding dusty jars and tins. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled across surfaces. A tin of biscuits, stale but edible. A forgotten apple, slightly bruised. And then a small mercy. A half loaf of artisan bread wrapped in paper and a wedge of hard cheese. It felt like a king's ransom. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the cheese. The aroma, sharp and rich, made her mouth water. She tore off a piece of bread, her movements hasty, desperate. She was about to lift the makeshift meal to her lips, a sob of relief building in her chest, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the doorway leading out of the pantry. It was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with a silence that was utterly inhuman. Lena's breath hitched, the bread and cheese falling from her nerveless fingers to the dusty floor. She couldn't scream. Terror had stolen her voice, her air. She could only stare as the figure resolved itself, still mostly in shadow but undeniably present, undeniably powerful. He was a silhouette against the faintest suggestion of light from a hallway beyond, and all she could discern was his height and a sense of immense, still presence. The millionaire vampire, Silas Blackwood, observed her. There was no immediate rage in his posture, no shout of alarm, just an unnerving, profound calm that was somehow more terrifying than fury. A flicker of something unreadable, like ancient starlight in deep wells, glinted in his eyes as they adjusted to the dim light, fixing on her. He didn't move to call the police, didn't threaten her. Instead, after a silence that stretched for an eternity, punctuated only by Lena's ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of her own heart, he made a subtle gesture with one long-fingered hand. It was an inclination of his head, a slight movement towards the doorway he had just emerged from, indicating she should precede him. Then, his voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant murmur, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed, surprisingly soft for such an imposing figure. "You must be hungry." It wasn't a question. He then turned, not waiting for her reply, and moved with that same unnerving silence deeper into the house, clearly expecting her to follow. Lena, frozen between terror and a bewildering spark of something she couldn't name, relief, disbelief, slowly, shakily, pushed herself to her feet. The gnawing ache in her stomach was momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold dread mixed with an equally cold, stark curiosity. What choice did she have? The ocean roared outside, a symphony of despair. Inside, a different kind of abyss beckoned. She followed the shadow into a cavernous hallway, her scuffed sneakers silent on ancient polished wood. He led her not to a kitchen, as she might have expected, but towards what looked like a grand dining room. Moonlight, weak as it was, now filtered through towering arched windows, illuminating a long mahogany table, its surface reflecting the dim light like dark water. Dust motes danced in the ethereal beams. Silas Blackwood didn't speak again immediately. He moved to a sideboard and with an economy of motion began to lay a single place setting. A linen napkin, heavy silverware that gleamed even in the gloom, a crystal goblet. It was a lavish, albeit solitary, dinner setting. For her. The broken girl who had broken into his house for food. The sheer incongruity of it all made Lena's head spin. The shame she had felt earlier returned, sharper now, mixed with a profound, disorienting confusion and a sliver of undeniable, overwhelming gratitude. He hadn't called the police. He was, it seemed, going to serve her dinner. The silence in the vast dining room was broken only by the clink of silver on china, as Silas Blackwood laid the impromptu table. Lena stood uncertainly by the doorway, her earlier terror now a thrumming undercurrent beneath a wave of bewilderment. The sheer audacity of her situation, a starving intruder being treated like an unexpected, if unconventional dinner guest, was almost too much to process. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place for such a large man, his dark clothing blending with the shadows, making him appear and disappear within the room's deeper recesses as he retrieved items. Finally, he gestured to the single chair he'd pulled out. "Please," he said, his voice still that low, calm rumble. It was an invitation, not a command, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority. Lena swallowed, her throat dry. I don't understand," she managed, her voice barely a whisper, raspy from disuse and fear. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Silas's lips, a fleeting expression that did little to soften the ancient sadness in his piercing blue eyes. Those eyes seemed to see right through her, to the gnawing hunger, the desperation, the layers of hardship that clung to her like the scent of the streets. Few people do when they first arrive here uninvited. He paused, then added, "But hunger is a universal language. And you are clearly hungry." He indicated the bread and cheese she had dropped in the pantry. That would hardly have sufficed. From somewhere within the depths of the mansion, a faint clatter. Then the aroma of warming soup began to drift into the dining room. Lena hadn't seen or heard anyone else. Did he have staff? Or was this some trick of the ancient house, or of the man himself? You're not going to call the police?" she asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Silas regarded her for a long moment, his gaze unnervingly direct. And what purpose would that serve, Miss? He let the question hang. Lena Petrova. Miss Petrova, would incarceration feed you, clothe you, offer you shelter from the storm that I suspect is more than just tonight's weather? His words were precise, devoid of overt pity, yet they struck a chord of understanding that disarmed her further. He knew, or at least he saw enough. Before she could respond, a warm bowl of what smelled like rich vegetable soup appeared on the table, along with a small platter of fresh bread, butter, and the same cheese she'd coveted earlier, only this time it was neatly sliced. There was also a glass of water. Silas himself brought them, moving with that preternatural quietness. There were no servants in sight. The sight and smell of the food were overwhelming. Lena's stomach clenched painfully. She looked from the food to Silas, her suspicion warring with the desperate, undeniable need. His expression remained unreadable, a calm mask that betrayed nothing of his thoughts. Was this a trap? Some elaborate, cruel game? But the aroma of the soup was too real, too comforting. "Eat," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You are safe here for now." Hesitantly, Lena sat. Her hands trembled as she picked up the spoon. The first mouthful of soup was an explosion of warmth and flavor, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, almost ravenously, a flush of shame rising as she realized how undignified she must look, but the hunger was too strong to allow for pretense. Silas watched her, not in a predatory way, but with a quiet, contemplative stillness, his own plate conspicuously empty. He merely sipped from a dark goblet, its contents obscured by the dim light. When she finally paused, a measure of strength returning, she looked up at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "Why are you doing this?" Silas leaned back slightly in his chair, his long fingers steepled before him. "Let us say that I understand desperation, and perhaps," he added, a flicker of something distant in his eyes, "I am weary of solitude. Even an unwelcome guest can be a change." This was the first hook, a question planted deep in Lena's mind. What was his true motivation? His kindness was too profound, too peculiar. He insisted she stay at least for a few days to recover her strength. "The coastal winds are unforgiving," he said, "and you are clearly not equipped for them. This house has many empty rooms." Lena, still deeply suspicious, but also overwhelmingly grateful, and with nowhere else to go, found herself agreeing. The alternative was the cold, unforgiving night, and the gnawing fear of Marcus Rigsby, the loan shark whose shadow had driven her to this desperate flight. The thought of Rigsby sent a shiver of pure ice down her spine, a cold dread that even the warmth of the soup couldn't fully dispel. Her past was a relentless hunter, and she wondered if even this strange, forbidding mansion could truly offer sanctuary. The next morning, Lena awoke in a vast antique four-poster bed, sunlight streaming weakly through a gap in heavy velvet curtains. For a moment she was disoriented, the luxurious softness beneath her a stark contrast to the cold, hard realities of her recent life. Then the memory of the previous night returned. The break-in, the terrifying appearance of Silas Blackwood, the unexpected dinner. She half expected it to have been a dream, a hunger-induced hallucination. But the scent of old wood and beeswax, the quality of the linen sheets were undeniably real. There was a tray on a nearby table with a thermos of tea, a piece of fruit and a scone. And beside it a pair of sturdy, new walking shoes, her size, and a warm, dark green woolen sweater. Her own threadbare sneakers and jacket were gone. This discreet act of provision, so practical and yet so thoughtful, sent a fresh wave of confusion and a reluctant warmth through her. It was the first tender moment, a silent acknowledgement of her needs that went beyond mere sustenance. Over the next few days, a strange routine began to establish itself. Silas was an enigmatic host. He was often absent, disappearing into the labyrinthine depths of the mansion for hours, sometimes entire days, only to reappear as silently as he vanished. When he was present, he was a quiet, observant companion. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. He simply provided food, warmth, a sense of improbable safety. Lena found herself slowly, cautiously, letting her guard down, though a core of watchfulness remained. Her past with men like Rigsby had taught her that kindness often came with a hidden, terrible price. She explored parts of the mansion, careful not to intrude too obviously. It was a place of shadows and echoes, filled with antiques shrouded in dust cloths in unused wings, vast rooms where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. The library was her favorite discovery, a colossal two-story room, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with books, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the ever-present tang of the sea drifting in from a slightly ajar balcony door. It was here one evening that Silas found her. She was tracing the spines of ancient tomes, her fingers lingering on the tooled leather, when he spoke from the doorway, making her jump. "Do you read, Miss Petrova?" "Lena, please, and yes, when I can." He entered, a book in his own hand. "This house has seen many readers, few in recent centuries." He gestured to the shelves. "Consider it at your disposal." They fell into a quiet conversation, first about books, then hesitantly about other things. It was during one such conversation, days later, over a simple meal of soup and bread, in the less formal setting of a smaller study, that the food connection twist revealed itself. Lena, feeling a little more at ease, mentioned the specific artisan bread and the sharp, crumbly cheese she had tried to steal from the pantry. "It sounds silly," she confessed, a blush rising, "but it smelled so good. I haven't had anything but, well, scraps for a long time." A strange look passed over Silas's face, a flicker of memory, distant and poignant. "That particular bread," he said softly, his gaze unfocused as if looking into a past Lena couldn't imagine. "And that cheese. A fromagerie in a small village in the Auvergne region of France used to make it. My mother, my human mother, she loved it. It was a rare treat, something we could seldom afford." He paused, the silence stretching, filled only with the crackle of the fire in the hearth. A lifetime ago, more than one. It was a small revelation, but it resonated deeply with Lena. It humanized him, this ancient, powerful being, linking him to a past where he, too, had known want. It forged an unexpected, fragile bridge between their vastly different experiences of hunger and loss. This sharing of a simple food memory became their second tender moment, a quiet intimacy in the vast, candlelit room. One afternoon, while Silas was away on one of his mysterious errands, business in the city was all he'd said, Lena stumbled upon a heavy oak door at the end of a disused corridor in the west wing. Unlike other doors, this one was bolted from the outside with a heavy, ornate iron lock. Curiosity, a dangerous but persistent trait, gnawed at her. What secrets did this locked wing hold? It was the second narrative hook, a tangible mystery within the already enigmatic house. Alistair Finch, Silas's lawyer, made a brief appearance one blustery afternoon. He was an elderly man, impeccably dressed in an old-fashioned Savile Row suit, his demeanor one of weary resignation mixed with sharp intelligence. He treated Lena with polite, if distant, courtesy, his eyes shrewd as he assessed her. His conversation with Silas, some of which Lena inadvertently overheard from the hallway, was all about offshore accounts, property management in various countries, and the usual quarterly precautions. It gave Lena a glimpse into the sheer scale of Silas's wealth and the complex machinations required to maintain his existence in the modern world. Finch also made a subtle reference to ensuring the Oakhaven Bluffs Historical Society stays focused on garden tours rather than foundation myths, a comment that piqued Lena's interest further. The prying eyes of the small insular community became a more tangible concern when Lena, feeling stronger, ventured into the small town of Oakhaven Bluffs for a few basic supplies Silas had given her money for. Her new, sturdy shoes and warm sweater made her feel less like an outcast, but she still drew curious stares. Oakhaven Bluffs was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. In the small general store, an elderly woman with sharp, bird-like eyes and an even sharper tongue, later identified as Mrs. Gable, the former housekeeper of a nearby defunct estate, watched Lena with undisguised curiosity. "You're new," Mrs. Gable stated rather than asked, her voice raspy. "Staying up at Crow's Nest, are you? Haven't seen lights up there in ages, except old Silas's study. He finally hire some help?" Lena, flustered, mumbled something about visiting. Peculiar man, that Blackwood. Always has been. Keeps to himself. Wise, some might say. This town has long memories and even longer tongues. Her gaze lingered on Lena. "You got a good head on your shoulders, girl. You'll need it up there." It was a cryptic comment, not unkind but unsettling. It hinted at local gossip and perhaps a deeper, unspoken knowledge of the mansion and its reclusive owner. The precarious peace of Lena's sanctuary was shattered a few days later. She was in the library, idly flicking through an old news aggregator on a tablet Silas had left for her use, a strange concession to modernity in the ancient room, when a small local news headline caught her eye. "Manhunt for missing man Marcus Rigsby intensifies, believed to be armed and dangerous." The article featured a grainy photo of the loan shark, his cruel eyes and predatory smirk sending a jolt of pure terror through Lena. He was missing, which meant he could be anywhere. He could be looking for her. The news report was the third narrative hook, pulling her past violently into her fragile present. Her breath hitched, and the tablet clattered from her trembling hands. The mansion, which had started to feel like a haven, suddenly felt like a gilded cage, with the hunter potentially circling outside. That evening, Lena was restless, the news about Rigsby replaying in her mind. She wandered the silent moonlit corridors, unable to sleep. As she passed Silas's study, she heard his voice, low and urgent. He was on the phone. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but an irresistible compulsion made her pause. "Thus the asset is secure for now, but the external pressure is mounting," Silas was saying. His voice was different, harder, colder than she'd ever heard it. "No, I don't believe they know its true nature, but their persistence is problematic. Finch is handling the usual channels, but we may need to consider more permanent solutions if they get too close to the Oakhaven Bluffs project. Yes, the girl complicates matters, but she is not a threat. In fact, she might inadvertently be a distraction." A pause. "Understood. I will monitor the situation. Containment is paramount." Lena slipped away, her heart pounding. Asset? External pressure? Permanent solutions? And she was a complication. A distraction. The cryptic phone call was the fourth narrative hook, plunging her into a fresh spiral of fear and doubt. Was Silas involved in something dangerous? Was her safety merely a byproduct of some larger, darker game he was playing? The man who had shown her such unexpected kindness, who shared memories of his human mother over simple food, was also capable of this cold, calculating tone. The hunger for connection she'd begun to feel towards him was now tainted with a renewed, chilling suspicion. Despite the unnerving phone call, Lena found herself unable to completely dismiss the quiet moments of connection she'd shared with Silas. He seemed to sense her renewed anxiety, though he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, one clear, cold night, he led her to a part of the mansion she hadn't discovered, an observatory, its domed roof retracting with a soft whir to reveal a sky glittering with 1,000,000 stars, far from the light pollution of any city. "The universe is vast, Lena," he said, his voice softer again. The coldness from the phone call seemingly vanished. "Our troubles, however large they seem, are but specks of dust in the grand scheme." He began to point out constellations, his long finger tracing patterns in the endless dark. Orion the Hunter, the steadfast pole star, the distant smudge of the Andromeda galaxy. He spoke of ancient astronomers, of myths woven into the stars, his knowledge seemingly as boundless as the night sky itself. This was their third tender moment, sharing the silent wonder of the cosmos. He was teaching her something, offering her a glimpse of beauty and perspective beyond her immediate fears. Yet the image of Orion the Hunter pricked at her unease. Was Rigsby her hunter? Or was there another unseen that Silas was contending with? The next day, Silas found her attempting to pick out a simple tune on the ancient, slightly out-of-tune grand piano in the cavernous music room. Her fingers were clumsy, but the melody, a half-remembered lullaby from her childhood, was clear. He didn't comment on her lack of skill, but instead sat beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he corrected her fingering, showing her a few simple chords. "Music, too, can be a sanctuary," he murmured, his proximity sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. Not of fear this time, but of something else, something complex and unsettlingly warm. The fragile piece, however, was destined to be short-lived. Lena had started to venture into Oakhaven Bluffs more regularly, partly to maintain a semblance of normalcy, partly because Silas seemed to encourage her to regain some independence, always providing her with funds for small purchases. It was during one of these trips, while browsing in a dusty antique shop on Main Street, that she saw him. Marcus "Shark" Rigsby. He was across the street, talking to a rough-looking man, his gaze sweeping the street with predatory intent. He hadn't seen her. Lena ducked back into the shop, her blood turning to ice. He was here, in Oakhaven Bluffs. Her carefully constructed, precarious world was about to come crashing down. She fled back to Crow's Nest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The news about Rigsby no longer an abstract threat on a screen, but a terrifying, immediate reality. She had to warn Silas, but a more horrifying thought struck her. What if Silas was the asset he'd mentioned on the phone? What if Rigsby, in his relentless pursuit of Lena and her meager imagined debt, had stumbled into something far bigger, far more dangerous? The antique shop owner, a Mr. Abernathy, was a known gossip, a contemporary of Mrs. Gable, though less overtly sharp. It was possible Rigsby had been asking questions about newcomers, about who might be harboring a young woman fitting Lena's description. Oakhaven Bluffs was small. A stranger asking pointed questions would be noticed. Then the briefing's twist about mistaken identity resurfaced in Lena's frantic thoughts. What if Rigsby wasn't just after her for the old, inflated debt? What if he'd somehow heard rumors about the reclusive millionaire at Crow's Nest, and seeing Lena there concocted a new scheme? Perhaps he believed Lena was a relative of Silas, someone he could leverage for a much larger sum. The thought made her sick. She wasn't just endangering herself anymore. She was a beacon, drawing this relentless predator towards Silas, towards the sanctuary that had, against all odds, begun to feel like home. She found Silas in his study, poring over ancient maps. "Silas!" she gasped, bursting in without knocking. "He's here! Rigsby! I saw him in town!" Silas looked up, his piercing blue eyes instantly alert. The calm, contemplative scholar vanished, replaced by something older, colder, and far more dangerous. "Describe him," he commanded, his voice low and steady. As Lena poured out her panicked description, detailing Rigsby's appearance, his known cruelty, and her fear that he might be after more than just her, Silas listened intently. He asked a few sharp, pertinent questions. Where she'd seen him, who he was with, what he was doing. "He may have been asking about me," Lena finished, wringing her hands. Or about you. What if he thinks I'm connected to you in some way he can exploit?" Silas rose to his full, imposing height. "It is possible," he conceded, his expression grim. "Men like this Rigsby are drawn to perceived weakness, and then to perceived wealth, like carrion birds. He has underestimated the nature of this place and its master." A chilling stillness settled over him. "But you are not to worry, Lena. You are under my protection." His words, meant to reassure, sent a different kind of shiver down her spine. The sheer, quiet deadliness that now emanated from him was a stark reminder that Silas Blackwood was not just a kind, reclusive millionaire. He was something far older, far more powerful, and the thought of Rigsby confronting that power was terrifying in its own right. The tension in Crow's Nest became palpable over the next 24 hours. Silas moved with a quiet, lethal grace, checking locks, observing the grounds from shadowed windows. He instructed Lena to stay away from the windows and to remain in the central part of the mansion. The vast house, once a place of echoing solitude, now felt like a fortress bracing for a siege. Lena, though terrified, found a strange sense of calm settling over her. She was no longer alone in her fear. Silas was with her, a formidable if frightening protector. She remembered Mrs. Gable's cryptic words, "You got a good head on your shoulders, girl? You'll need it up there." The old woman had seemed to possess an unnerving insight. Lena wondered if Mrs. Gable knew more than she let on, not just about Silas, but about the dangers that sometimes washed up on Oakhaven Bluff's shores. Perhaps the unexpected ally was closer than she thought. That night, the storm that had been brewing offshore finally hit Oakhaven Bluffs with full force. The wind screaming like a banshee, rain lashing against the ancient stone walls of Crow's Nest. It was the perfect cover for a man like Marcus Rigsby. The attack, when it came, was brutal and direct. There was no subtlety to Marcus Rigsby. Under the cover of the raging storm, he and two thuggish associates, their faces grim and shadowed by hoods, breached the outer perimeter of the estate, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel drive, masked by the roar of the wind and sea. They clearly weren't expecting sophisticated defenses, perhaps assuming the reclusive millionaire was an eccentric old man, protected by little more than his reputation and the house's forbidding appearance. Rigsby, however, seemed driven by a particular avarice, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light that went beyond simply recouping Lena's paltry, imagined debt. He'd likely heard whispers in town of the Blackwood fortune, seen Lena coming and going, and concocted a grander, more lucrative scheme. Ransom, extortion, perhaps even believing Lena was a key to Silas's wealth, a vulnerable relative to be exploited. The first indication of their presence was a sudden violent crash from the ground floor, the sound of reinforced glass shattering in the conservatory, a place Silas often frequented in the quieter hours. Silas, who had been standing like a statue by the main staircase, his senses preternaturally alert, didn't even flinch. He simply turned to Lena, who was huddled nearby, her face pale but resolute. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument. "Barricade the door to the library. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." But Lena, no longer the terrified, broken girl who had stumbled into his pantry, shook her head. "No, I can help. I know Rigsby. I know how he thinks. He's cruel, but he's also predictable in his brutality." She clutched a heavy iron poker she'd taken from the fireplace, her knuckles white. Her street smarts, honed by years of survival, were kicking in. She had faced down bullies and threats before, albeit not on this scale. A flicker of something, surprise, reluctant approval, crossed Silas's face. "He will not be expecting you to fight." "He won't be expecting you either," Lena retorted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. The intruders were making their way through the ground floor, their shouted calls echoing through the vast halls. "Petrova, we know you're in here, and tell your rich boyfriend to come out and play." Rigsby's voice, harsh and grating, cut through the storm's fury. Silas moved then, not with human speed, but with a swift, silent deadliness that was breathtaking. He was a shadow flowing through the deeper shadows of the mansion. Lena, her heart pounding, followed at a safer distance, poker held ready. She saw Silas intercept the first of Rigsby's men in the grand hallway, a swift, brutal takedown that was over before the man could even cry out, a dark shape crumpling to the floor. Rigsby and his remaining thug, hearing the scuffle, charged forward, brandishing crude weapons, a crowbar and a heavy wrench. Rigsby had a wild, desperate look in his eyes, clearly unnerved by the silence and the sudden disappearance of his accomplice. "Show yourself, old man," he roared. It was then Lena acted. Remembering Rigsby's almost superstitious fear of anything he couldn't control, a remnant of a grifting past where he'd often used feigned bad luck to intimidate victims, she screamed, "Fire! The East Wing is on fire!" Her voice, amplified by the echoing acoustics of the hall, was surprisingly convincing. She then smashed the poker against a large brass gong that stood near the dining room entrance, the resounding boom momentarily stunning Rigsby and his man. The diversion, crude as it was, worked. Rigsby hesitated, his eyes darting towards the East Wing, momentarily distracted. It was all Silas needed. He moved like a phantom, disarming the second thug with a precise, disabling strike. The man went down with a strangled cry, clutching a broken wrist. Now it was just Rigsby, cornered, his bravado rapidly crumbling as he faced Silas, who stood bathed in the flickering light of a candelabra Lena had lit earlier, his eyes like chips of ice. "You should not have come here," Silas said, his voice soft, yet carrying the weight of centuries. Rigsby, desperate, lunged not at Silas but at Lena, who had inadvertently moved closer. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, his arm a vice around her throat, a rusty knife suddenly appearing in his hand, pressed against her skin. "Stay back, freak," he snarled at Silas, his eyes wild. "Or the girl gets it. I just want the money, what she owes me, and a little extra for my trouble." Lena gasped, the cold steel against her throat terrifyingly real. But in that moment of terror something shifted. She saw Silas's face, and it wasn't the cold, detached power she'd sometimes glimpsed. It was a raw, unfiltered fury, a protective rage so potent it seemed to make the very air around him shimmer, and beneath it a flicker of what looked like anguish. "Let her go, Rigsby." Silas's voice was deadly calm, but Lena could feel the immense power coiled within him, straining for release. "Not a chance. We walk out of here nice and easy or she bleeds." Rigsby tightened his grip. It was then that Silas made his choice, his sacrifice. Instead of unleashing his full inhuman power, which would have undoubtedly ended Rigsby but could have also terrified Lena or exposed his true nature irrevocably, he took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "There is no need for this. You can have money, whatever you think she owes." Rigsby sneered. "I think she owes me a lot, and you're going to pay it, old man." He started to drag Lena backwards towards the broken conservatory windows. Lena knew this was her moment. She couldn't let Silas be blackmailed, couldn't let Rigsby win. Remembering a tactic she'd seen in a self-defense class she'd briefly attended years ago, she stomped down hard on Rigsby's instep with the heel of her sturdy new boot. He roared in pain, his grip loosening infinitesimally. It was enough. Lena drove her elbow back into his ribs with all her might. He grunted, stumbling, and in that split second, Silas moved. Not to attack Rigsby, but to pull Lena away, shielding her with his own body as Rigsby, enraged and off balance, slashed wildly with the knife. The blade caught Silas high on the arm, tearing through his dark coat and shirt. Dark blood, shockingly crimson, welled instantly. Silas barely flinched, his focus entirely on getting Lena to safety. He shoved her behind him, towards the main staircase. "Go! Library! Now!" But Lena didn't run. Seeing Silas bleed, seeing him put himself between her and danger, solidified something within her. This strange, ancient being, who could have annihilated Rigsby in an instant, had chosen to protect her, even at the cost of his own injury. Loyalty, fierce and unexpected, surged through her. "No!" she cried, grabbing the iron poker again. "I'm not leaving you." Her defiance seemed to startle both men. Before Rigsby could react or Silas could argue, there was a new sound cutting through the storm, the distinct, unmistakable wail of police sirens growing rapidly closer. Rigsby's face went from rage to panic. Cops? Who called the cops? He looked wildly around, then at Silas, then at Lena, his predatory confidence completely shattered. At that moment, the main door of the mansion burst open, not with another intruder, but with Mrs. Gable, her sharp face framed by a rain-soaked scarf, looking remarkably unfazed. Behind her stood two uniformed police officers, their expressions grim. "Heard a commotion," Mrs. Gable announced, her voice cutting through the din. "Sounded like Mr. Blackwood was having some uninvited, rather rowdy guests. Thought Oakhaven's finest might want to sort it out." She gave Rigsby a look of utter disdain. "Some riff-raff just don't know when they're not welcome." This was the unexpected ally, Mrs. Gable, not with ancient knowledge of vampires, but with good old-fashioned community watchfulness and a timely call. She had likely seen Rigsby and his men lurking, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and had decided that whatever was happening at Crow's Nest, it was trouble that needed official intervention. Her presence and that of the police instantly changed the dynamic. Rigsby, faced with mundane law enforcement rather than a supernatural entity, dropped the knife with a clatter, his hands shooting up in surrender. The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing blue lights in the stormy darkness, stern voices, and the ignominious departure of Marcus Rigsby and his subdued accomplice, handcuffed and miserable. The third man, still unconscious, was taken away by paramedics who arrived with the police. Mrs. Gable, after giving a concise statement to the officers that cleverly omitted any hint of the truly unusual aspects of the evening, gave Lena a sharp, appraising look. "You hold up all right, girl?" she asked, a surprising softness in her usually brusque tone. "Told you you'd need a good head on your shoulders up here." Then, with a nod to Silas, who stood silently in the shadows, his injured arm pressed to his side, she departed with the police, leaving an unnerving, rain-lashed quiet in her wake. Once they were alone, the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving Lena shaky but strangely exhilarated. She turned to Silas, her gaze immediately going to his bleeding arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice laced with concern. Silas looked down at the wound as if surprised to see it. A scratch. It will mend. But the dark stain spreading on his sleeve was significant. "Let me help," Lena insisted, already moving towards a side table where she remembered seeing a decanter of brandy, not for drinking, but for emergency antiseptic, a holdover from another era. She found a clean linen napkin in a drawer. Her earlier fear of him, of his true nature, was overshadowed by a more pressing human concern. He had bled for her. Silas allowed her to tend to the wound, his usual reserve replaced by a quiet weariness. As she carefully cleaned the gash, it was deeper than a scratch, and bound it with strips of linen, their proximity was charged with unspoken emotions. The silence was no longer one of suspicion or enigma, but of shared experience, of a bond forged in crisis. "You could have dealt with him easily," Lena said softly, her fingers brushing his cool skin. "Why did you let him hurt you?" Silas looked at her, his blue eyes dark and intense in the flickering candlelight. "Because, Lena," he said, his voice a low murmur, "your fear of what I am is a greater threat to me than a man like Rigsby. I would not purchase my safety at the cost of your terror." This emotional revelation, his willingness to endure injury to protect not just her physical self, but her perception of him, struck Lena to the core. It was a profound act of trust, of care. In turn, her choice to stay, to fight alongside him, had shown him a courage and loyalty he hadn't expected. The fragile trust that had been tentatively growing between them had, in the crucible of that night, solidified into something strong, something resilient. When the wound was bandaged, Silas finally spoke of the future. "Rigsby will trouble you no more. The authorities will deal with him as the common criminal he is." He paused, then met her gaze directly. "You are free to go, Lena. I can provide you with resources enough to start anew somewhere far from here, somewhere safe." It was a genuine offer, devoid of any expectation. Lena looked around the vast, shadowy hall of Crow's Nest, at the signs of the recent struggle, at the ancient, imposing man who had become her unlikely protector, her confidant. The thought of leaving, of returning to a world that had offered her nothing but hardship and fear, felt wrong. This strange, haunted mansion, with its enigmatic, centuries-old vampire owner, had become the only place she had felt truly safe, truly seen. "And if I don't want to go?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. A slow, almost human smile touched Silas's lips, a genuine smile that reached his ancient eyes, warming them. "Then Crow's Nest has many rooms, and its master finds he is less fond of solitude than he once believed. He didn't offer her a role as a servant or a kept woman. He offered her a place, a presence, an unconventional companionship. Lena knew her life would never be ordinary, but as she looked at Silas, she saw not a monster, but a being of immense loneliness who had shown her profound kindness, a protector who valued her for who she was. She saw a future, not defined by desperation, but by a strange, unexpected connection. "I think," she said, a small smile of her own playing on her lips, "I'd like to see what blooms in your conservatory in the spring." The thematic lessons were clear, not spoken, but lived. Compassion could indeed be found in the most unexpected of individuals, even a creature of the night. Her own vulnerability, her desperate act of breaking in, had paradoxically led her to find a profound strength and an unshakable ally. And Crow's Nest, the forbidding mansion on the cliff, had become her safe haven, a place where she could finally begin to heal and rediscover hope. The next morning the storm had passed. A pale, watery sun was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the turbulent Atlantic in hues of rose and gold. Lena found Silas in the conservatory, the shattered pane of glass already meticulously cleared away, a temporary repair in place. He was examining a delicate orchid, its bloom a defiant splash of color against the lingering gloom. He looked up as she entered, the first light of dawn catching his pale features, softening their ascetic lines. He offered her a small pair of gardening shears. "These camellias could use some tending," he said, his voice calm, imbued with a quiet contentment she hadn't heard before. Lena took the shears, her fingers closing around the cool metal. She stood beside him, the scent of damp earth, blooming flowers, and the clean, salty air filling her lungs. Together, the broken girl and the millionaire vampire, they began to tend to the plants, a silent, comfortable moment shared as the new day broke. It was a vivid, closing image of new growth, of a future no longer defined solely by darkness or desperation, but by the quiet promise of shared light and the enduring strength of an unlikely, extraordinary bond. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe, hit the like button, and comment what you thought. Pick a link on the screen for more stories.